The Diablo series has been a staple in my game library for almost 30 years. And over that time, each installment has played a very different role in my gaming history. Diablo 1 was my first time experiencing meaningful character progression and a freely explorable town hub, with memories of my first butcher kill and playing on Battle.net permanently seared into my brain. Its sequel, Diablo 2 and Lord of Destruction, is likely the game that I've spent the most hours playing in my life, outside of World of Warcraft of course, regularly returning to the game every few years since its release. Though Diablo 3 wasn't an ideal successor, partially due to my own expectations, I still have fond memories of smashing my head through Inferno on release, and pursuing build-defining drops, like Greer Falcon's Foot and the Jankum board. And Diablo 4, despite my sincerest efforts to enjoy it, was one of the least engaging games I've played in recent memory. But the game has some areas of surprisingly strong execution. The music, the art, and some other features are relatively strong. But it embellished some of the features of Diablo 3 that I didn't love, like loot frequency and excessive player power. And it also introduced new designs, like creature scaling and auto-navigation, which pushed Diablo 4 further away from the gameplay that defined the series' roots, and I don't think that's a good thing. Diablo 4 is an important showcase for how strong execution from multiple departments, which can be very difficult to achieve by the way, can be overridden by foundational design choices to produce a game experience that just feels meaningless. For me, that is. What was a series founded on cautiously exploring dangerous dungeons now features auto-navigation to a map marker on a warp-speed pony. What was once a game with clear progression relative to increasingly challenging creatures now features scaling game systems that produce an effectively flat difficulty curve. Where once there were fewer, more meaningful gear upgrades, there is now a deluge of meaningless upgrades that have little to no functional impact on gameplay. What was once a game where the environment was used to control enemy numbers because of player vulnerability is now about jumping into the middle of large packs of enemies and spamming flashy cooldowns. You get the idea. In this analysis of the Diablo franchise, I'm going to be comparing the systems, features, and campaign experiences of Diablo 1 and 4, dipping into Diablo 2 and 3 occasionally. To help with the understanding and appreciation of how much the series' core designs have shifted over the years, we're going to start the retrospective by looking back at Diablo 1 and some of its core designs, touching on what made it great, what were some of its flaws, and most importantly, we'll establish a foundation for our analysis of Diablo 4. In part 2 of this series, we'll start our assessment of Diablo 4. We'll look at how modernizing the series has stripped it of much of the tension and meaningful gameplay that the series has built its name on. I know that Diablo 4 changes and maybe even improves after you've done the campaign and reached the end game. But we're focusing on the campaign because it's generally the most expensive content to develop, and it's the first X hours of a game that all players have to experience. And yeah, it might be silly to compare two games which were released nearly 30 years apart and are separated by multiple sequels. Game series change over time, sometimes dramatically, and that's okay. D2 and D3 show the design bridges that connect Diablo 1 and Diablo 4. But when someone enjoys playing the original game in a series, for the first time in over 20 years, more than they enjoyed the latest installment, I think it's worth examining why. Is it just nostalgia? Or is there something else going on? What did the developers of each game think made for good combat, quests, loot, exploration, narrative? And how has that perspective changed over time? These are all things we'll explore in this series. But if you enjoy Diablo 4, that's great. Sincerely, I don't think you're wrong for liking it or disagreeing with me on every criticism I make in my design analysis. This is simply an assessment about how, for my taste, the series has devolved over time. So, come on, join me in an exploration into a franchise that was founded on this and has been modernized into this. One of the top-selling PC games of 1997, Diablo is the story of a lone adventurer, unless you're playing online, and their journey through Tristram, attempting to unravel the mysteries about the evil that is afflicting the town and its inhabitants, slaying the avatars of that evil along the way. Diablo is the benchmark against which many future ARPGs were measured, with original reviewers of the title highlighting, quote, elegant simplicity of an action game and the addictive storyline of an adventure game with the personalization and exploration of an old-school RPG, with the review moving on to praise the replayability value and the loot system. With slower-paced gameplay, compared to modern Diablo at least, aspects of resource management, and some of its visual and audio theming reminiscent of a horror game, Diablo is able to impart a feeling of vulnerability on the player. At least on me. The player isn't an all-powerful being, carving through packs of demons with ease, unless you research game guides. They're an adventurer who often moves slower than their enemies, has limited potions, can be stun-locked, the player doesn't have a 100% chance to hit their enemy, and they're not supported by a generous and automatic checkpoint system. Although these features can certainly be annoying, when they're all taken together, they're able to make moments like this, where you unexpectedly run into a pack of powerful enemies, genuinely tense. And that tension, when combined with resource management, player vulnerability, and atmosphere, makes Diablo occasionally feel like a survival or horror game, instead of a high-action RPG. One of my most vivid memories of gaming as a child was watching my older brother playing through Diablo online with a friend, who was walking him through the game for his first playthrough. When he came across the butcher's room, the nerdy teenager opened the door just for a second to trigger the fresh meat before slamming the door immediately and then moving on. Despite being highly overgeared for the encounter, the game's systems and atmosphere made that encounter genuinely frightening and intimidating enough to actually avoid for a young teenager. But even as an adult, playing through the game with some vague memories of its content, it's still able to create some startling, if not tense moments, like the first time I ran into a rhino guy, or this abnormally agile goat. The tension that the game is able to produce was not necessarily because the game is dark and spooky, although it is. There's tension because survival is far from guaranteed. Unlike modern Diablo, encounters aren't necessarily tuned to be survived head-on, so the player needs to find a way to survive them. And things like the player's movement speed, or lack thereof, are important factors in that tension and vulnerability. Diablo limits the player's movement speed to walking, unless you're teleporting. There's no run, there's no rolling or dodging, and it can be frustratingly slow when exploring large areas, backtracking, or returning to town. Though it can be easy to say that movement speed as slow as Diablo 1's is just bad design, it does serve an important gameplay purpose. To illustrate that, let's have a little look at some survival horrors, action horrors, whatever they're called, like Resident Evil 4 or Dead Space. Those games create a lot of their gameplay tension through limiting the player's movement speed and mobility, much like Diablo 1 does. Whereas Diablo 4's combat would look a little bit more like this version of Resident Evil 4. More on that later. By limiting the player's movement speed and introducing features like hit stuns, Diablo 1 is able to create some additional layers of gameplay complexity that wouldn't necessarily be present if the player had higher mobility relative to their enemies. This plays a vital role in combat and how the player approaches encounters, especially for melee characters. Many of the creatures in Diablo 1 move as quickly as you do. This makes one consider how you will approach different creature compositions, how you might have to outmaneuver them using the environment, how you can use the environment to limit the number of creatures you're going to fight at one time, or how to corner or cluster them together. These are considerations I rarely found myself having to make while playing Diablo 4. Though the slower speed of movement does introduce some interesting strategic considerations, it also comes with quite a few issues. The player's movement speed can put melee characters at an extreme disadvantage when fighting ranged enemies, as the enemies will flee from melee attacks, but not from ranged attacks. This results in some terribly frustrating, drawn-out encounters comprised of mostly chasing down your target, landing a single hit, if you're lucky, and then chasing them down some more. So there are ways around this, like building a melee character that has enough dexterity to use a bow, or enough magic to use Stone Curse. But because there is no way to reallocate spent stat points, it's impossible to make these pivots later in the game. You have to plan for these diversified builds from the outset of your adventure. And if you didn't, too bad. You're going to be doing a lot of chasing. Diablo's combat has some other contentious features, like chance to hit, which grossly devalues the strength stat. The game also features hit stuns, Another system that, while annoying, adds some layers of complexity to the game. Again, you can't always just walk away from a dangerous encounter in Diablo. If you're not careful, it's very easy to find yourself getting stun locked or being unable to walk away from an encounter. Some other features, which may be considered unnecessary friction to some modern gamers, include things like item durability, town portal scrolls, item identification scrolls, recovering your body to get your gear back, manually refilling your potion belt, and inventory management.
I gotta pawn some of this stuff. Too much baggage.
These are systems that the player has to remain mindful of, and have very real implications for gameplay, because poor planning can have some pretty significant outcomes, like being stranded in a dungeon if you don't have any portals, losing all your gear if you can't safely get back to your body in multiplayer, or permanently destroying an important piece of gear due to durability loss. These systems make for planning, strategies, and gameplay that is unique in the context of modern games, and certainly unique compared to modern Diablo. They also help form D1's more expedition-oriented gameplay, where you adventure till you run out of potions, scrolls, a town portal, an item needs repairing, or your inventory fills up, at which point you return to town, identify items, repair your gear, stock up on potions and scrolls, and then dive back into the dungeon. Then you repeat this cycle over and over. These systems make for a starkly different experience from Diablo IV's streamlined gameplay. But do all these additional, perhaps menial features ultimately make for a good player experience? That'll depend on who you ask. I enjoyed them, but it certainly won't be for everybody. Doing things like trying to weapon swap or refill your potion belt manually while low on life and being pursued by enemies can make for some crazy tense gameplay. But I think a lot of modern gamers would find that micromanagement and fiddling in the inventory screen to be abrasive and an artificial modifier to the game's difficulty. That's a pretty easy argument to make, actually. It's fun, but clunky. Modern Diablo has effectively eliminated all of these features to produce a more streamlined experience. And if you were trying to adapt the series for mass appeal, this might be one of the approaches that you try to take. But I think it makes the gameplay super generic. The resource management systems and expeditionary gameplay loop of Diablo 1 facilitated considerations and decisions that Diablo 4 removes. Now, Diablo 4 features carefully tuned potion drop rates, no item identification, a massive inventory with uniform items, fast movement speed, infinite town portals, removal of chance to hit, removal of hit stuns, and I'm sure there's some other things that I've missed. By stripping out these features, Diablo 4 creates a much simpler, more accessible gameplay loop. But overall, despite many points of frustration, I found that the aforementioned systems of Diablo 1, which some players might consider friction, to add to my level of mental engagement with the game, ultimately creating a more engrossing and more positive experience for me than Diablo 4's relatively mindless gameplay. But if you want to play a Diablo game that requires a little less mental engagement, fewer systems to manage, and less consequential gameplay, Diablo 4 is probably a better bet. And again, we're just talking about the 35 or so hour campaign experience here. I know that D4's endgame can get pretty twitchy, tense, or whatever you want to call this kind of gameplay. Further contributing to Diablo 1's atmosphere and tension is its method for narrative delivery. When you enter the cathedral, there are no cutscenes, and there are no followers who could provide you with levity or guidance. It's just you exploring and fighting your way through labyrinthian levels, looking for quest objectives or ways to descend deeper into the darkness. The game's narrative is almost entirely delivered through conversations with the townsfolk of Tristram, or the occasional lorebook or conversation with an untrustworthy NPC in the dungeons. But for the vast majority of the time you spend in the dungeons, the narrative doesn't interfere with the flow of gameplay, enabling long stretches of time where you're alone, fighting the evil below Tristram. The game rarely pulls you out of that gameplay loop to deliver narrative. If the player wants greater context for their quests, they can choose to spend time in town talking to the townsfolk about their current objective. You can find out what Jillian thinks about the Halls of the Blind, or what Pepin thinks about it, or what does Ogden think about the Black Mushroom. Sometimes their responses are relevant to your journey, giving you some nice supporting lore for the quest. And sometimes their responses just lend flavor to the world and its inhabitants. But it's the player's choice to seek out this additional narrative detail. Or they can totally ignore it, and only experience the dialogue boxes that come up from turning in a quest, which only happens a few times in the whole game. It's very minimal and unintrusive if the player wants it to be. The wealth of optional quest dialogue and the limited in-dungeon dialogue all support the continuous tension of the gameplay instead of regularly and mandatorily breaking it up for the sake of story, as Diablo IV tends to do. I don't know why they chose this direction for Diablo 1's narrative. It might be because it was relatively cheap to implement, or it might have been their ideal design, regardless of budget. Either way, I think it's an excellent direction for the game. The narrative is there for those who want it, and it maintains gameplay tension. It's great. Blizzard used a very similar narrative delivery for Diablo 2. But D3 and D4 go in quite a different direction for their story delivery, and it's much more intrusive and explicit. We'll talk about this in great detail in the next video. And these changes might seem like a logical, almost necessary way to modernize Diablo's narrative delivery, but I don't think that's true. D1 and D2's narrative delivery style, and its relationship to gameplay, are similar to another series, genre, developer library, whatever you'd call From Software's Souls-like games. Both of the early Diablos, and many of From Software's Souls-like games, feature a narrative hub as a core mechanism for story, and when the player is out in the world, conversations and narrative breaks are present, but they're limited, keeping the gameplay loop and the tension of exploring the world largely unobstructed. And I think it works really well in both Diablo and Souls-like games. These Souls-likes demonstrate how a narrative delivery system similar to the early Diablos, when supported by a Diablo-like gameplay loop, can still work for modern audiences. Again, it's a great model for maintaining tension while exploring and in gameplay, while offering story to those who seek it out. Now, despite the praise I've given Diablo 1, the narrative delivery is certainly imperfect, demonstrated by the town's total lack of reactivity in conversation after you've completed a quest. These quests you're sent on affect all of the townspeople, and the fact that they only comment on your deeds if they assigned the quest to you is kind of weird. Sure, it was Pepin who sent you to clean out the water supply, but all the townfolk benefit from the cleansing. And everyone had something to say about the butcher before I killed it, but nothing to say in response to its death. Even if you're carrying the cleaver around town, they don't care. The storytelling is primitive, and it could be improved, but it's functional, and it serves the gameplay well, which is probably the most important thing. And I think it's preferable to Diablo 4's narrative delivery, which constantly halts gameplay to deliver story. Though I truly enjoyed playing through Diablo for the first time in over 20 years so that I could make this video, the game has a lot of gameplay and systems issues. Let's chat about a few of those issues. Though I generally like the game's expeditionary loop, in the endgame, Diablo 1's deep reliance on purchased potions and the power of staff spell charges makes returns to town to restock, recharge, and repair happen a bit too frequently. The game's deep reliance on drinking potions does not synergize well with the manual restocking of your potion belt, and the game's slow movement speed in town, plus the town's physical size, makes that process of restocking, repairing, and recharging somewhat tedious. The game's difficulty curve is inconsistent near the end of the game, ramping up massively in Act 4, requiring up to a dozen casts of a spell to take down a single Lexington steel. And that increased difficulty, when combined with fleeing and teleporting characters, makes pure melee builds pretty frustrating to play. Gear durability can be lost rapidly, which can make an item's destruction feel unfair. Loss of all gear in multiplayer if you can't recover your corpse makes it feel like you're playing on pseudo-hardcore mode. And perhaps most glaringly, the difficulty in Nightmare in Hell ramps up to a point where it is almost unplayable if you don't use a game guide, and melee characters are essentially bricked. It gets super hard. So if you consider beating Nightmare and Hell as truly beating the game's difficulty balance is questionable, to say the least. When played in the context of modern games, Diablo 1 absolutely shows its age. And even for its time, it was far from perfect. But today, it's still an enjoyable title. And my enjoyment is, at least partially, directly or indirectly due to some of those aforementioned features which might be considered antiquated, intrusive, or even aversive to many players. And when these features are examined individually, like player hit stuns, slow movement speed, or manually restocking your potion belt, they do sound bad. But when all taken together, they provide the player with a unique, tense, rewarding, though frustrating, game experience, which can easily stand out from a group of modern, generic ARPGs. Frankly, I had a lot of fun playing Diablo 1, and I found it to be more engrossing than the vast majority of games that I've played in the past few years. I was more than happy to immediately replay the game's short, very short, campaign on multiple classes just to experience how they progressed through the game differently, and each time it felt worth it. Because of the random nature of the game's drops, layouts, and quests, and how differently the game's archetypes play, each replay was different enough to remain entertaining. And as someone who has drifted away from playing video games as a hobby over the past decade or so, playing a game that can hold my attention for more than 1 hour is a rare feat. If you're interested in playing Diablo 1, but are a little hesitant about some of the more old-school features, I strongly recommend checking out the Devolution X mod for Diablo 1. It delivers a lot of quality of life changes, like fast walking in town, quickly putting potions into your belt, UI changes, increased resolution and frame rate, variable game speeds, which you can see here, and a ton of other features. But it still largely maintains the core gameplay and makes the game much more accessible. It also has online play, and I had a lot of fun playing online with a friend. Sincerely, check it out, it is lovely. I'm very thankful that it exists. Alright, that's it for part 1 of this series. Come back for part 2, where we will briefly touch on Diablo 2 and 3, and then start our in-depth analysis of Diablo 4 systems and features. Thanks for your time. Bye-bye.